The origins of women's suffrage. One of the big things that comes out of the progressive movement is the idea of women's suffrage or temperance. And what temperance simply means, or what, what suffrage means, of course, is the right to vote. We'll talk about temperance in a few seconds, kind of jump the gun a little bit there. Calls for women's suffrage started as early as back as in 1848. Now, what we'll tell you is that when you look at women's suffrage and that fight that starts in 1848, it was also involved, of course, in abolition. So abolition, of course, or the abolishment of slavery happens in 1865, of course, with the end of the Civil War. As early as 1848, people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, they were also active in terms of looking at the abolition movement. But what they felt like was if you can get the slave, of course, freed, then maybe it'd be more likely, of course, that women can get the right to vote. So in 1848, at Seneca Falls, Elizabeth Cady Stanton led the movement, of course, to get women's suffrage. And as we said earlier, it was tied to the abolitionist movement that happens in the 1860s, that ends in the 1860s, of course, with the freeing of the African slave. You have two primary organizations that fight for women's suffrage in the late 1800s. You have the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association. The National Women's Suffrage Association was led by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And on the other side, the American Women's Suffrage Association by Lucy Stone and Julia Ward Howe. They both wanted women's suffrage. They just couldn't agree on how to go about getting it. The ones from the National Women's Suffrage Association believed that what they should do, of course, is get the government to pass an amendment and guarantee women the right to vote. With the American Women's Suffrage Association, they didn't think that America was ready for that. What they felt like is they should take their plea, of course, to the state level. And by taking it to the states, and if you got enough states, of course, that gave women the right to vote, then eventually the national government would see it as being something, of course, that needed to be done and could be done. So, and when you look at it, because of the American Women's Suffrage Association and their tactic, we're going to find that you're going to have Western states that give women the right to vote, particularly states like Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and Idaho by 1900. Now, women don't get the 19th Amendment that gives them the right to vote, of course, until 1919 or so. So when you look at it, you would have to say that the American Women's Suffrage Association tactic, of course, was better than the National Women's Suffrage Association's tactic. The only difference was they were smart because they understood that one of the things that they could do is leverage the few numbers of women, of course, in the West. And what happens is a lot of these Western territories will tell women if they come to those states, then they, of course, will give them the right to vote. And what they were hoping to do, of course, is attract women out there so that men would have women, of course, to marry, and they can get the population up by, of course, reproducing. On the left, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton from the National Women's Suffrage Association. And then on the next slide, we have Julia Ward Howe and Lucy Stone from the American Women's Suffrage Association. Now let's make sure you understand both methods are effective. It's just that Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony played more of the long game. In 1890, the women's suffrage movement united under the banner of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. So both of those two groups merge and become one. And the leader of that new group is going to be Carrie Chapman Catt. Now what she will do, of course, is she will raise money. And what she basically does is she lobbies these politicians that are running for office and tells them, if we'll give you support in terms of monetary support if you come around to our way of thinking about giving women the right to vote. And because of her efforts, the 19th Amendment will be passed and women will be granted the right to vote. Here's a picture of Carrie Chapman Catt on the right, and then a person, of course, that also helped with the National American Women's Suffrage Association would be Alice Paul. The focus on society's zeal. It wasn't just about making government better or giving women the right to vote. It was also about solving some of the issues that American factory workers, of course, were having in American cities. Some progressives focused on social problems in America like crime, illiteracy, alcohol abuse, child labor, health and safety of Americans. And the progressive created charities to solve social ills. Many times women were at the forefront of the charity movement. So it was about sanitation. It was about Public education. It was about, reducing crime. And when you look at a lot of these people these progressives were, they believed that the number one issue that caused a lot of the society's ill had to be two things. Number one, it was big businesses and their practices, but they also believed that it was alcohol. It was the drink. And we're going to find that there's going to be an effort in the country. Here we go. We talk about women's temperance. This is what we tried to jump the gun on you a while ago about. But what they're going to try to do is to link a lot of society's ill to alcohol. And because of that, another amendment will be passed a little bit later, of course, that will outlaw alcohol in the United States of America also. The most emotional issue for progressives was unregulated child labor, which was highlighted by muckraker John Spargo's book, The Bitter Cry of the Children, which allowed children to work in mines for 60 cents a day. And a lot of people believe that children shouldn't be working. Progressives believe that they shouldn't be working. They shouldn't be working. They should be in class or in school learning. Now, the only problem is a lot of Americans didn't like the idea of children not working, because if children didn't work, in some cases, families didn't eat. So it was kind of a double-edged sword. Everybody recognized that children needed, of course, to be educated, but American families needed them to work. So it was kind of one of those double-edged kind of things. They want kids to have educations, but families need kids, to work so the families, of course, could eat. Here's John Spargo, The Bitter Cry of Children. Here's Florence Kelly. Because of her efforts, we're going to find that she works very hard to create something called the Children's Bureau, which will work to limit the limit the amount of children that are working in the workplace. What she wants to do, of course, is to make sure that kids get an education rather than get jobs. The government's authority to regulate businesses was supported by progressives, especially regarding workday hours and issues. The Supreme Court held that the government could intervene and limit the workday for women, but employers had the right to establish the contract, of course, with men. In other words, this here. Because of the progressives, the Supreme Court said it's fine if women, of course, didn't have to work a 12-hour day or 10-hour day, and it would be all right, of course, to limit the amount of time that women work. But in terms of looking at men, of course, who were supposed to be head of the families and taking care of families, needed, of course, to work. So the Supreme Court was very reluctant, of course, to create a work day, an 8-hour work day, of course, for men. Now, one of the things that we also happen at the city and city level, of course, and the state level, is going to be the creation of zoning laws and creation of things like blue laws. Zoning laws would tell people where places, of course, would be set aside, of course, for businesses, and places set aside, or areas set aside, of course, for residency. Also, the creation of blue laws, and the blue laws regulate any number of different things at the city level in terms of what kind of businesses, of course, can operate on Sunday, for instance. And like in the state of Mississippi, it's a little bit different than the state of Louisiana. You can't buy alcohol in the state of Mississippi, hard liquor in Mississippi on Sunday. But in Louisiana, if you cross the Mississippi River into Louisiana, you can buy it 7 days a week. One of the issues was safety, especially when you had women and children, of course, working. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory kind of emphasized that a lot. And what the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire did is that, you have women and children, of course, that die in this particular, catastrophe that happens here. They die because the exits, of course, weren't clearly marked. They had different things on the floor that people couldn't get to the stairwells, of course, to get out. And we're going to find that the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory is going to start changing the way that people work, of course, in these confined areas, in these confined buildings. Every place, if you're looking around in your classroom now, or looking around, of course, in any public building, you'll see exit signs. There'll be exit signs in Spanish in some cases, and exit signs, of course, in English in this particular country, because everything has to be clearly marked. So when you look at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, one of the things that it does is it highlights for the first time that when people are working for businesses, businesses have a responsibility to make sure that they are safe in the workplace. In 1879, we finally get to women's Christian temperance again. It was created by Frances Willard, and it advocated for women's suffrage, equal pay, for women, no child labor, and an 8-hour workday, and prison reform and prohibition. Temperance leaders believed that alcohol was the root cause of most issues facing American families. The efforts of the temperance advocates led to the passage of the 18th Amendment that will create one of the most glamorous periods in American history in the 1920s. And we'll talk about that, of course, in the weeks to come. Here you have Frances Willard, who created the Women's Temperance Union and Christian Temperance Union. And here you have Carrie Nation. Well, it was kind of, I don't know if it's funny to you, it was kind of funny to me. In one saloon, as I was doing some reading, they posted a picture, well, it was a statement, really, a picture of a statement. And it was one of the bar patrons says, "Every nation's welcome except Carrie Nation." Now her name is Carrie Nation, so they will take anybody from any place throughout the world. The only person they didn't want to see was this lady. So the only nation that wasn't welcome was her, because she would show up, of course, with that Bible, and then she, of course, you notice she has an axe in her hand. And what she would literally do is go in and bust the bottles, of course, in the saloons, and shame people basically into not drinking. Many progressives believe that government had the responsibility to regulate big business. Their efforts did lead to some government regulation, the passage of the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890, which initially had little power but becomes a cornerstone of trust and monopoly breakup. Well, that gets us back to that lesson-focused question. This is, how did the progressives movement improve American society? Well, if you think about it, we gave you some good ideas in terms of what the progressive movement was about. There were certain people and certain areas, of course, that the progressives that wanted to improve. So, take a moment, look at that particular question and see what response you have, and we'll come back in a few seconds and we will look at what it is some of your possible responses could be. Okay, you should have enough time as you were able to go through and look at the focus question. And if I'm answering this question, these are some of the things that I, of course, identify. How did the progressive movement improve American society? It passed laws to make food safe, like the Meat Inspection Act. It created the graduated income tax, or the 16th Amendment. It gave people more influence in government. Recall, initiative, referendum, and 17th Amendment. Gave women the right to vote, the 19th Amendment. Outlawed alcohol with the 18th Amendment. Passed blue laws, as we said, and health and safety codes and zoning codes. And ended child labor and created compulsory public school. All right, a few practice questions that we'll have for lesson one. It says, use the list to answer the question. The passage of the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th Amendment, the outlawing of child labor, the creation of charity organizations to help the poor and immigrants. The movement most responsible for the reform was A, the populist movement, B, the social gospel movement, C, the progressive movement, D, the temperance movement. Well, they all were related to some degree, but the only one, of course, that could be a possible viable answer would be the progressive movement. Have one more question. Which statement would a progressive least likely agree? Least likely. Think about what the progressives were about, and when you look at these answers, think about one that they would not support. The government should expand regulation of railroads and big business. Businesses should pay income taxes on their profits. Child labor should end and children should go to school. D, the government should have a limited role in societal reform. Well, when you think about it, three of those things, of course, the progressives were all about. The only one that they were not all about would be D, the government should have a limited role in societal reform. That concludes lesson one, from populism to progressivism. Remember what we always tell you. Don't take my word for it when it comes to progressivism or anything that we talk about in U.S. history, because remember, it's American history, which means it's your history. So we'll see you next time, and we'll look at lesson number 2.